without further ado, I will be getting the show on the road. Let me just move it along. So to start off, just a little bit of information about Western Neighborhoods Project. We are a community history nonprofit that has preserved, interpreted, and shared the diverse history and culture of San Francisco's West Side since 1999. And we do that in a variety of ways. Programs like this, we lead history walks, we have a website at outsidelands.org, and we're always up to something fun. So I encourage you, if you enjoy this program this evening, to become a member. You can be a part of the W&P family, or even just donate to help us continue to do programming like this. And in 2014, in support of this project, we launched the Open SF History Program to preserve, scan, digitize, and make available thousands of historical images of San Francisco, even beyond the West Side. And you can find that at opensfhistory.org. And all the photos you will see tonight are from this archive. And now I will introduce our first guest, or rather I'll let her introduce herself. Melanie Bishop, take it away.
Hi, everyone. Sorry, I'm testing out a new headset tonight. My name is Melanie Bishop. I am a member of the San Francisco Citywide Cultural Resources Survey and Landmarks team with SF Planning. Excited to be here with you all tonight to talk about a really exciting topic. Thanks.
All right, and next we have the woman of the hour, Jane Cryan, known as the Cottage Lady. Welcome, Jane.
Hi, thank you. Hi, everybody in the virtual audience. I am so excited that you're there. I wish I could see every one of you. I wish we were in the Lurie room at the old main library, but this is better than nothing at all. And oh, I can't wait to start telling you everything you want to hear about the shacks and the shack cottages.
Thank you, Jane. This is Jane's third Zoom ever, so she is doing fantastic. Thank you, Jane. And next we have Woody LaBounty. Take it away, Woody.
That picture is like 14 years old, but that is me, and I am happy to be here. I am the Vice President of Advocacy and Programs at San Francisco Heritage, and I had a little bit to do with earthquake cottages myself a few years ago, so that's why I'm here tonight and happy to be here.
Thank you, Woody. Also, you know, some of you may know he co-founded Western Neighborhoods Project. So before we get into the nitty-gritty of the shacks, I thought maybe I'd give a little bit of an overview of what the 1906 earthquake and fire was. And all the information I'm about to give you is a very, very small amount, a quick overview of from the Earthquake Shacks theme document that all three of these individuals contributed to significantly today. So I won't be giving all the details. You can read more about it in the document we'll give you a link to. But so on April 18th, 1906 at 5:15 a.m., there was a 7.7 to 7.9 magnitude earthquake that struck San Francisco. Now, to give some context to that, the Loma Prieta earthquake in 1989 was a magnitude 6.9, so bigger than that. It leveled homes, it destroyed civic buildings, and worst of all, it ruptured gas lines that sparked several fires that you see here. And the fires burned for 3 days and would be difficult to contain since the earthquake also broke several major water conduits. And as a last resort, the city began dynamiting buildings to create fire breaks, if you can believe that. Much of downtown was in ashes, and in just 2 days after the earthquake, as you see here. So for context, here's the same burned area overlaid on a current map. In total, the fire burned 4.7 square miles of San Francisco, which is more than the Great Fire of London in 1666 and the Great Chicago Fire in 1871. If you'd like to see a broader spectrum of photographs of the damage that the earthquake and fire caused, I encourage you to go to our website, outsidelands.org, where opensfhistory.org, where we have a whole gallery specific to this earthquake. And we also will be adding some more postcards about the earthquake and fire in this week, so stay tuned for that. So most of Nob Hill, Russian Hill, Telegraph Hill, and the Tenderloin downtown and the Mission District were in ruins after this earthquake and fire. And an estimated 3,000 people were killed in the quake, and over 78,000 people just left the city. Hundreds of thousands of San Franciscans that stayed were displaced, either because their homes were destroyed or they were just too afraid to return to them. So they grabbed whatever they could, as you can see here, and sought refuge in the city's parks. So this is Hamilton Square right after the earthquake. You can actually see the smoke and from the fires in the distance. And what I love about this photo from our archive is you can see people have just grabbed trunks, steamer trunks, they've grabbed mattresses. They're all just trying to figure out what's next, sort of in a daze. And nearly 300,000 people slept outdoors on the night of April 18th. And what you see here is Hamilton Square. Again, it's a really evocative photo where you can see people just sort of trying to regroup. You've got a guy in the bottom left-hand corner who looks like he's eating Cracker Jacks, someone who's sort of dazed and confused next to somebody who's sleeping. You've got everybody trying to sort of begin to put together some makeshift shelters. But this situation wasn't going to be sustainable long-term. It needed to be improved. And the city actually began organizing recovery efforts almost immediately. US Army troops were deployed from the Presidio and other posts to assist, providing medical treatment and supplies, food and water and shelter, like the tents that you see here, also in Hamilton Square a little bit later. Meanwhile, the Committee of 50 was established by Mayor Eugene Schmitz to steer relief efforts, assisted by the American National Red Cross and the Associated Charities of San Francisco, which is now known as the Family Service Agency, and of course, the Army. It was clear that makeshift shelters and tents like these near Market Street in Laguna in May 1906 were not a permanent solution to this problem. They made it kind of difficult to distribute food and supplies, among other issues. And despite coordinated efforts, there were nearly 1,000 refugees with no form of shelter in early summer 1906. So the city began to develop better housing for refugees. And by the way, this is a view from Mint Hill, and the apartment building in the center left is still standing, if you're curious why that looks familiar. So ultimately, 31 permanent camps like Camp Richmond, that's seen here because, you know, we're a West Side history group, were created. The refugee housing program was overseen by the Department of Lands and Buildings of the San Francisco Relief and Red Cross Funds Corporation, which is more commonly referred to as the Relief Fund or Relief Corporation. And this was created when the Committee of 50 I mentioned earlier merged with the Red Cross in July of 1906. They solicited proposals on permanent refugee housing, and Superintendent of Parks John McLaren actually recommended that all the refugees would be relocated in the sand dunes of the Sunset and the Richmond districts. Now, this plan was originally rejected because the commissioners thought that no one would want to move that far away from their homes. But they did agree and settle on mass-produced cabins to be located in public parks. Now, John McLaren was a little bit miffed. He wasn't consulted about the plan, about taking over his parks, but the plan did move forward, and the cabins were allowed, provided that they all be removed by October 1907. And McLaren was given the final say on the design and the color, which he picked as dark green. So initially they thought that they would build 3,000, but approximately 5,610 were constructed by March 1907. And this housed over 16,000 displaced San Franciscans. And these cottages became homes, something that's portrayed in scenes that you see throughout photographs we have in our archive. Construction was actually overseen by the Department of Lands and Buildings Chairman Thomas McGee, who selected contractors, including the Leonard Frost Company, to build these different refugee shacks. And Joseph Leonard, by the way, of the Leonard Frost Company, would go on to build many neighborhoods on the west side, like Jordan Park. Building was delayed a little bit, you know, like so many things are when you're doing a massive construction project in San Francisco. But finally, concerted efforts to build began in 1906. And the Richmond camp that you see here was camp number 25. It was bounded by 13th and 14th Avenues and Lake to Cabrillo streets. Now this photo is, you're looking on California near 14th Avenue, and you can see a headquarters building on the right, as well as a dispensary. So these were like little towns that popped up. So these cottages became home, like I said before. You can see refugees, kids playing, you can see laundry hanging on the wire. And you can also see many more refugee cottage photos on our website. And Jane, maybe you can help me out here. There were several different types of refugee cottages, right? Can you explain a couple different types for us?
Were you speaking to me, Nicole?
Yes, Jane, how many types of earthquake shacks were there?
Okay, I'm sorry. I was so fascinated with the photo that I zoned into it. There were 3 sizes of shacks settled on: small, medium, and large, or A, B, and C. There were only 500 of the type A refugee shacks built. So they're a very rare commodity to still have in the city. And I didn't haul out a bunch of details to have it at my disposal here, because I just didn't. So I can't tell you how many were built of each, but I do know 3 sizes: small, medium, and large.
Mm-hmm.
I do know, Jane, from what I remember from your research, the smallest, the type A's, were about 10 by 14, sometimes like 11 by 15. And the largest were something on the order of like 18 feet by 24 feet. Those were like the type C's. That's all from memory. So
that's fairly correct, Woody.
Okay. Yes. That's what I shoot for, fairly correct.
And all of this is in the earthquake theme document too, if you want to fact check our experts here. So like any home in San Francisco, there's always someone who has to outdo their neighbor, right? Like I said, these kind of became home. This is at a camp in Jefferson Square. And to be quite frank, I don't know exactly what's going on with this little structure, but he was too cute. I couldn't not include him here. Have any of our experts seen a customized refugee dwelling like this before?
So, you know, the camps were run very much on sort of a military basis. So I don't think there was a lot of latitude to customize or paint them differently or add details while they're in the camps. So this feels to me more like some kind of market or bar or some kind of crazy thing next to the camp more than in the camp.
Yes.
So.
Woody, I agree with you. Lands and buildings never would have allowed any deviation from the park bench green, and never would have allowed this sort of treatment.
Yeah.
I have never seen that photo. That's very interesting.
I found it in our archive as I was researching other photos, and I couldn't pass it up because this is the cutest thing I've ever seen.
Yeah.
You're there.
I just want to also point out in this photo, Nicole, the buildings along the street there that survived the earthquake, survived the fire, but didn't survive redevelopment is my guess. So.
Yeah, so this is Jefferson, or I'm sorry, Hamilton. So you're on Geary, right? And you're looking northwest to Pierce and Post, but redevelopment is another Zoom event, I think.
Yeah.
On this one. So refugees leased their cottages. $2 was collected each month, and if paid in full, by August 1st, 1907, when the camps began closing, then you were considered the rightful owner, and the building, you were required to remove it from the camps. And this allowed a lot of people to become first-time homeowners, which was an interesting part of this narrative, many of whom would never have been able to afford a home in San Francisco otherwise. So you see, it's always been too expensive to buy a big house.
Could I just insert something there?
Yes, please.
The city of San Francisco had no legal right to charge people in the shacks in the camps rent, or to consider them being leased by the refugees. So what the refugees paid for their shacks was called an installment that was fully refunded back to them when they found a lot to move their shack to. Shack or shacks. Just wanted to make that clear.
Yeah, it was very complicated because there were a lot of people who were worried about creeping socialism if they had given people money. And so they tried to really work out a way that legally they could make sure that the refugees paid something into their future of getting these cottages and taking them somewhere. So that was the mechanism that they used.
So the San Francisco Relief Survey estimated that 5,343 shacks were moved to private land after the camps closed. And a 1907 account in the San Francisco Chronicle said, and I quote, "Everywhere one goes, from the ferry to the cliff house, one sees teams laden with little green cottages moving hither and thither without any concerted destination." And this is part of a much longer quote that's included in the earthquake theme document. But here you see a horse team removing the last cottage from Jefferson Square on August 23rd, 1907. And the 2x4s on the side, they're there to brace the cottage as it moves so nothing happens to it. So the earthquake shacks were repurposed into permanent homes. And this is one of my favorite photos of several of them in situ. This is on Caselli and Clover in Eureka Valley. And sadly, these were either demolished or moved, some during construction of the Twin Peaks Tunnel and some a little bit later. But neighborhoods that saw a lot of these cottages moved into them were the old Ingleside racetrack that was developed. Nearly 200 shacks were removed or relocated there. And of course, Bernal Heights has a high concentration as well. And those who lived in these shacks really loved them. And people have been passionately looking to preserve these shacks since very early on. Take, for instance, we have Mother Minerva here. This is Minerva Hartman. A 94-year-old former nurse who served in kind of all the wars. It was the Civil War, the Spanish-American War, the Indian Wars, the Crimean War. She was even supposed to be friends with Florence Nightingale. Now, Mother Minerva had an ability to promote herself, and a lot of what she claimed has never been proven, but it did make a really good story. And who are we to argue with Mother Minerva? She was known, and we can verify this, that she did live in 3 repurposed earthquake shacks that you see on the right down by the Daly City-Colma border. And when this structure was threatened with the widening of El Camino Real there, she said no, she wouldn't go. And she was known to protect her premises with a little Colt pistol in her pocket. So I use this story because she's a colorful San Franciscan, but also because it shows you that people have been defending these cottages for all time. And maybe she was the first cottage lady, but I do believe the most glamorous cottage lady is on the program with us tonight, because Jane, you are our favorite cottage lady, and maybe you can tell us what your history is and why you got involved in the refugee cottage game. Oh, Jane, I think you're on mute.
Can you unmute her, Nicole? There you go.
Oh, there we go.
Am I live now?
Yep,
You're live.
Oh, great. First of all, I want to say I am just so happy that WNP has given me the opportunity to speak again about the shacks. It's been 40 years since I moved into the little red house, which you see behind me, which is how San Francisco landmark number 171 looked at the time it was landmarked. And I had no knowledge of what it was. I was into my third year of working toward a career as a Dixieland jazz piano player. Since 1971, I had spent every single Sunday of my life at Pier 23 Cafe on the Embarcadero, and I had just fallen in love with Dixieland jazz. That's all I wanted to be. So I and my nearly 6-foot grand piano moved into the little red house, which looked like something that belonged on Tobacco Road when I moved into it. And the day I moved in, 2 gun-toting sheriffs appeared at the door to evict me. Apparently the people who had been there before the place was leased to me got into some sort of trouble, and the sheriff had come to take them out of the cottage. But that was quickly straightened out. And oh, I was so happy. I was in a place with my piano where I could play piano 24 hours a day. I could have big jam sessions, and I had all my musician friends over, and we all went outside to the street. We'd have a bunch of us playing as loud as we could. We'd go out to the street, and believe it or not, you couldn't hear a sound. So I was just in 7th heaven. And I'd been in the cottage about a month when a very elderly neighbor who lived across the street came over while I was working in the little front yard, and he shook his finger at me and he said, "Young lady, do you know that you're living in a couple of relief houses just pasted together?" I said, "No, I didn't know that." "Oh yes," he said, "and I know because my family and I lived in that cottage after Solomon Getz, the developer who took gobs and gobs of the shacks and put them in the Richmond and the Sunset. After he had placed it on the lot, this gentleman whose name, of course, he's departed. He was very elderly 40 years ago, so I'm sure his name was Mr. Collin, and I will remember his first name, but it went out of my head right at the moment. Well, that opened the door. So I went to the History Center at the main library and asked if there was anything about the relief houses after the quake. And by the way, at this point in 1982, when I moved into that cottage, I had lived in the city 20 years. And I knew nothing about the April 1906 quake. I don't even recall at that time of ever having gone through even a slight quake in 20 years. I had no knowledge of any part of San Francisco history. My whole life was writing poetry and playing my piano. That was it.
That sounds great.
Yeah, it was. Well, it didn't last long because Mr. Collin opened this door and I went to the History Center and I was told, "Gee, all we have is a book called the San Francisco Relief Survey that has a few pictures in it." Well, that wasn't exactly true, but I didn't know. But I got lucky. Simultaneously with moving to the cottage, I was hired as executive assistant to the #2 man at the San Francisco newspaper agency. And simultaneously with going to work there, one day I had a call from a reporter with the New York Times, and I thought it was a fake call. I thought somebody was pulling a joke on me. I said, "Oh, come on, who is this? You're not with the New York Times." Well, it turned out to be legitimate. The reporter came to the cottage and did quite an article that appeared in the New York Times, and that caught the attention of a professor of architecture at UC Berkeley, Dr. Del Upton, who brought a team of student architects to this site and did a proper measurement of the entire cottage and taught me a whole bunch of history about the construction and, oh, I mean, wow. So the thing was on a roll almost immediately. And since I was now an employee at the news agency, and there was nothing about these relief houses, I made an appointment to see Richard Tyriot, who was the publisher of the Cryan, and went up to his office and I said, "Gee, I'd kind of like to learn something about these relief houses." "Oh, the refugee shacks." "Okay, sure. What do you need?" And I said, "Well, I understand that you have all of the old Cryans on microfiche, and I wonder if I can come in and look at them." And he said, "Well, sure, as long as you do it on weekends or holidays." So I spent 2 years in the Cryan Library on weekends and holidays rebuilding the history.
Jane, what was it? What was it about the cottage that made you this impassioned about it? I mean, not everyone does this when they learn they live in an earthquake.
It talked to me as soon as I moved in. The whole thing talked to me. It was a little world unto itself. 3.5 type A's, a little over 500 square feet. It had a vestibule, it had a parlor, had a formal dining room. It had a kitchen that once was an entire A shack, but the shack had been cut in half, and one half was a tiny little bedroom. And then in the half A shack at the back was another bedroom. It was the whole world. And it had a front door and it had a side door. And then in the backyard was this wonderful bee shack that you see on the screen, with a wonderful tenant who you see here. I caught him candidly. One day I stuck my camera out the bathroom window because that was how I could get a good picture of the bee shack. And he happened to come out at the same time. So everything started to roll. And then I thought, gee, I'm learning every day. I was learning more and more about the history of the camps and everything from the Chronicle newspapers. And I thought, gee, I think I'm going to found a society, and I'll find all the shack cottages in the city, and we can all get together and show each other our shack cottages and have little tea parties or garden parties at them. That was the sum total of what I was going to be doing.
So how did you get from tea parties to landmarking?
Yeah. Well, what happened, the cottage was in such bad shape on the exterior. I went to the agent for the land, the property owner, and I said, gee, do you think he could provide some money to have the front cottage painted. It looks so awful. Well, the property owner gave me $500, and with that, I was able to engage a professional painter who knew what he was doing, and all that the $500 would cover was what you see from the street and the side, the one A shack going east to west and one A shack going north to south. And then to get the rest of the cottage painted, I called on my resources that I had developed when I was assistant manager of 500 Sansom Street, corner of Sansom and Clay. And one of the painters from Eddie Zielinski's painting company came out on his days off, and he finished off painting the front cottage. So that was how it got so beautiful. But anyway, the property owner was just thrilled with what I had done. And I had barely been there a year when all of a sudden, all the neighbors on both sides of the street, who all had all my phone number and everything, my work number, I was getting calls right and left. There's a for sale sign on your cottage. Oh my God. I almost dropped dead, I really did. And I had been there 1 year, and the Shack Society was just starting to roll. And that was basically the end of my peaceful life there, because for 1 whole year, the real estate agent for the property owner brought people through all the time.
Right.
It was just awful.
So
And that's when I had to go into action, because he was advertising this little San Francisco treasure as looking just like the cottages in Sausalito. I was so angry when he put that in his ads for selling this cottage. And I did try. The asking price was, this was 1984, was around 131,000.
Wow.
And yeah, I tried so hard to find someone to go in with me, another person, and I did. And I found a young interior designer who loved cottages, and he and I tried to get financing together to make the guy an offer, but we couldn't come up with enough money, so it was lost. And then after it had been on the market for 6 months, then I got the sense that the owner was going to do a demo on it.
Mm-hmm.
And now, I was just a piano player and a woman who worked as an executive assistant in office buildings. I had never done anything like this, but one day I knew I had to call. I had to find out how to keep this site from being demolished. So one day I picked up the phone, I called City Hall, and I said to the person who answered the phone, "Can you connect me with someone who can tell me how to save a cottage from demolition?" And she said, "Oh, of course I can."
Mm-hmm.
And she sent me up to the secretary to the Landmarks Preservation Advisory Board, a young man named Jonathan Malone. And oh my gosh, he was just wonderful. And the rest is history.
And so it's City Landmark number 171, correct?
That's right.
And this was the first of many things you got involved in. The next being the Goldie Shacks. Can you explain a little bit about the Goldie Shacks too?
Oh my gosh. I was, the Board of Supervisors evicted me from the cottage as a concession to the property owner. Mm-hmm. And I was not feeling very happy about my involvement with refugee shacks at that point. And that was the point that the Goldie shacks came into my vision. And I had just given the Shack Society, this is a little bombshell that people who have followed the Shack Society for a while, nobody knows this. Ron Ross, the founder of San Francisco History Association, and I founded our societies at the same time. And I used to go to his events, he'd come to mine, and we became friends. And when I was evicted from that cottage, they wouldn't even let me stay until it had actually been sold. I called Ron, I said, Ron, I want somebody to keep working on this issue, but it's not going to be me. Would you take my Shack Society? And he said, oh, sure, I'll take your shacks. He knew that he would be giving the society and everything back to me. And I gave all my research to somebody I really want to mention. She was a San Francisco city guide at the time. Her name is Jo Falcon. And this woman, as soon as she read about what I was doing, she was at the door. She came and she looked at my research and said, oh my God, you know, this is great. Because I had never done this. I really didn't know what I was doing. Well, I gave all my research, which was in 2 little file tubs at that point, to Jo Falcon. So I farmed everything out to Ron Ross and Jo Falcon. And a couple of months later, I came to my senses and they gave everything back to me. And I went into action.
So the Goldie shacks are in the Presidio, and the photographs you see on the left.
Okay. So at the time, all this hoopla is going on with me losing the little red house, this darling woman from the Richmond district comes over. She lives in a building across the street from the Goldies. She says, you got to help me save these shacks. I said, oh, I had given everything up. I didn't want anything to do with the shacks anymore. And she was so persuasive. I ended up thinking, okay, well, maybe I'll do one more save on these things, and that's it. And so I started working with her about them. Well, she got the Planning Association for the Richmond District involved. And gosh, I should have looked up her, I should have read in the book I've written what her name was. But the woman who got the Army involved was a highly placed member of the Planning Association for the Richmond. Mm-hmm. And she contacted the Army. I guess she knew the top colonel there or something, the commander of the 6th Army, mm-hmm. and got him involved. All of a sudden, I had a call from the museum director of the Army Museum, a guy named Eric Saul. Mm-hmm. And the Goldies were on their way. And
yeah, you can see in these photos, that's the Army Corps of Engineer moving the shacks from their location.
Yeah. And guess what? I got a story about how they got the 2 buildings off the lot. I was there every day. That was the most fascinating thing. The street was lined with hundreds of people every day watching the Army. They treated these buildings like they were eggs, uncooked. I mean, it was just unbelievable. Okay, so they get all the garbage off the shacks, and there are 2 shacks sitting on the lot. And and I'm eavesdropping all the time, making sure that they're not going to do anything bad to these buildings. And they couldn't quite decide how they were going to get them off the lot onto their huge truck.
Mhm.
So I had a picture that Dick Terriot had allowed me to use for my slideshows that showed shacks being moved on and off lots with big greased timbers. So I showed the engineers this slide and I said, well, here's how they did it in 1908. You want to try that? Yeah, that's the way to go. So they quickly got big timbers and huge pails of grease and they slid them off the lot. Oh, there's Billie Holiday. Hi, Billie Holiday.
Act like she's not here.
Well, she's finding this story fascinating. She just had to be in the picture.
She is,
So-
but okay, so they get the homes off of the lot on big grease timbers. That's insane.
Yeah, they did it the same way they did in 08, 07, 08. And then all of the dignitaries in San Francisco showed up on that lot the day the two cabins went onto the truck.
Wow.
President of the Board of Soups, Gladys Hanson from the history room, the city archivist, a whole bunch of dignitaries. And somehow I ended up standing right next to the property owner, whose name was Veronica Tedeschi. And she and I somehow ended up standing next to each other. We looked at each other and we started laughing and we couldn't stop. It was the craziest thing. I mean, here's the city is making this solemn occasion out of the cooperation of the army and the city, and it's all very solemn. And then Veronica Tedeschi and I are still standing there laughing like hyenas. And everybody turned around and looked at us, and we finally got hold of ourselves. Yeah, that was really something. Oh, and then I've got another little tidbit. The army was concerned about people getting hurt. Well, the shacks were wrapped in swaddling clothes and put under the Golden Gate Bridge for quite a while until they got their plan together. And then when the site was all readied and they were going to winch the shacks onto the pads they had made for them, Eric Saul called me and he said, the Army's not calling the press. There should be media here because this thing is big. Why don't you, and I'm naive. Heck, I take directions, especially the museum director. He tells me to call the press. I'll do whatever he says. So I called out the press. It was a huge press show up. My God, even Bryant Gumbel, I forget what channel he was on, he did coast to coast coverage of the Goldie shacks being dropped on the cement pads. And it even went as far as Hawaii. And all of the top brass at the Presidio of the 6th Army, they were absolutely ready to have heart attacks, and they came running down to to Eric Saul's office asking him what was going on, but it was too late. And in the end, they were very happy at how it turned out, because the PR for the Army made it sound as though, the Army was such a good neighbor and was cooperating with the city of San Francisco and blah, blah, blah. It was the cutest thing.
And this Veronica Tedeschi and the Goldie Shacks and your incredible research are what first introduced me to your society, because I worked at the Golden Gate National Recreation Area and I was in charge of cataloging those shacks and everything inside them. So your manuscripts, your work has helped so many historians working in this field.
Really?
Oh my
Wow.
gosh, yes. I was so excited to be put in touch with you. And there's good news for everybody. Everyone can access your work and your research. It's down, it's at the San Francisco Public Library. This is the finding aid for Jane Cryan's Refugee Shacks collection. You can go to the 6th floor in the History Center and ask for SFH9. And you were the first person that we called. That might actually be a lie. Woody can tell that story more straight than I can, but Western Neighborhoods Project also has a history with you and the refugee shacks, and I'll let Woody tell that story from here.
Yeah, and these aren't very, attractive photos of the cottages we saved. This is when they were kind of getting ready to be moved and they were boarded up, but they actually look better than this. I'll tell you what happened, and there's a person on this meeting, I think, who is responsible for this. Don Andrini over at San Francisco Heritage, which is where I am now. Don, I think, contacted me. Moses Corrett, who is still at the planning department, had talked to Don about a permit, I believe, or maybe these were for sale. I can't remember what it was, but there were 4 cottages that were on one lot, and they were 2 residences. And the owner was actually very amenable to having them moved or saved or something done with them. He was getting on in years and he wanted to sell the lot and build something new for his kids, essentially. So I don't know if we should have stepped in on this, but it's good we did. We did save 3 of the cottages. One was too chopped up to really be restored. And it was a long process that took a lot of time for WMP to be involved in. But it's true, one of the first people we reached out to, of course, was Jane Cryan. I was delighted that she was still in town because I had heard she was going to take off to Wisconsin. And then Jane came out every day. And I got to say, the great thing about Jane is she adopts the earthquake shacks that we try to save. She doesn't see them as buildings. She doesn't see them as, I don't know, something separate. They're almost like children that need care and attention and nurturing. So I remember Jane telling me, I think it was with the Goldie Shacks when they were being restored in the Presidio, that she would be there every day with knitting, and she would sit there and knit while they worked on it, just to be like the mother hen, making sure that her children were well treated. And she did the same with the Kirkham Shacks. She came out and talked to the press for us, gave lots of advice, provided lots of background material. And then when a whole lot of people stepped up to volunteer to help restore them, including Maida and Jensen and Sheedy Crane and other people that we recruited. We got a lot of help from Lawrence Cornfield, who was down at the city at the time, and the San Francisco Zoo, which allowed us to hold on to the shacks there while we worked on them. Jane was just there as a great resource to sort of like explain to everybody, every workman who came on and didn't know anything about the shacks, what their history was, how they were built, and basically just be that guardian angel that's there to make sure they're done right. So the good news is it was a lot of ups and downs, I can tell you, but we really were excited for the 100th anniversary of the 1906 earthquake and fire to have one of the restored shacks on Market Street, so that the thousands of people, well, let's say many hundreds of people showed up at Lotta's Fountain at 5 in the morning to note the 100th anniversary, could walk half a block and walk through an earthquake refugee cottage that had been a shelter to so many of their ancestors, mine included, and really get San Francisco and San Franciscans back on their feet. Inside, we had a lot of interpretive material so people could understand how important they were. And then eventually, with some help from the San Francisco Historical Society and the San Francisco Zoo, we were able to keep that restored cottage on public display. And it's still there in Greenie's Conservation Corner at the San Francisco Zoo. It does need a paint job, by the way. if anybody from the San Francisco Zoo is on the call. But it still is there, and it's really a testament to all the work we had done. The other 2 cottages were moved to Oakland to a nonprofit that uses them as artist studios. So that was very cool and a great place for them to go. I gotta say, by the end of it, David Gallagher and I, who spent so many hundreds of hours on this project, were just relieved that all this work and all this effort, resulted in something where they were still on public display and still being used, because that's really the story of the earthquake cottages. Is they were a savior to so many people who needed help at the time. And they need to be remembered for that, but they also need to be used so that people, because that's what they were built for. They were built to be used and occupied and to have life inside them. So it was a good result for a very long project. And I gotta say, I just am so grateful to Jane and to Dawn Andrini and to everybody who helped along the way to help us save that little piece of San Francisco history.
And you started to do a survey of your own, right? You and Jane and David and some other people?
I won't say it's an official survey. I do think that people kept coming up and saying, I think this is one. And then we would go out, and this I know happened to Jane in her early days with the society. You start becoming the person who validates and verifies that the ones that are still around. And Moses Corrett at planning would often go out and take a look at different little sheds and outbuildings and try to figure out if they are earthquake shacks. I know people are going to ask, how do you tell if one is? It's a little bit intuitive, but we're going to have Melanie kind of explain how the planning department has really tried to codify what you look for, what the size, what the dimensions are, what the materials are, so that you can kind of tell when something is just a garden shack that somebody built or something that came from the great earthquake and fire of 1906.
And keeping an eye on these shacks is important because some disappear, some change over time. And that's why we're so glad that San Francisco Planning picked up the baton, so to speak. So Melanie, maybe you can explain the work you all are doing with this today.
Yeah, thanks, Nicole, and thanks, everyone. I do just want to start by saying that this document is really made up of the work of a lot of people that came before my time at the department. So Jane, obviously, Woody, Western Neighborhoods Project. This document wouldn't be possible without all of that hard work. The Earthquake Shacks theme document was adopted by the Historic Preservation Commission on November 17th, 2021. And earthquake shacks were identified as a theme within the single-family subcontext and residential context of the larger citywide historic context statement that we're working on as part of SF Survey, our citywide cultural resources survey effort, which I'll talk about a little bit later. So to start off, what is a historic context statement? I'm sure not everyone is familiar with that term. Historic context statements are a tool that we use to provide an analytical framework for identifying and evaluating resources. As defined by the California State Office of Historic Preservation, context statements explain what aspects of history, culture, and geography shaped the physical development of a community and identify what important property types were associated with those developments. So context statements provide criteria for evaluation based on the identified theme or context and associated property types. We use the National Register of Historic Places criteria for evaluation, which is seen here on this slide. A lot of you are probably familiar that properties can be found significant for a variety of reasons, including for their association with significant events and trends, important people, and or as a distinctive type of architecture or the work of a master architect. Properties can also be found significant for the potential to yield archaeological information, though this criterion is used a little bit less commonly. When we evaluate properties for eligibility under these criteria, we also have to consider the property's integrity or level of alteration. And this is grounded in an understanding of the property's physical features and how they relate to its significance. So as I mentioned, the Earthquake Shacks theme document is one of many themes, subcontexts, and context statements that we'll be preparing as part of SF Survey. The goal of the Earthquake Shacks theme document was to gather all of the existing research conducted by our community into one place to create a tool for the future recommendation of properties for historic designation. The document provides an overview of the Earthquake Shack typology and provides considerations that will assist department staff in identifying and evaluating Earthquake Shacks consistently across the city. Additionally, as part of this effort, as Woody kind of alluded to, we are maintaining an internal list of suspected or verified earthquake shacks submitted to us by community members. So we're now the kind of earthquake shack people that are holding that information. So anyone's welcome to submit that to us and we'll kind of ping onto it. Our list is currently at just over 100, though I suspect there are many more that we'll identify as part of our survey efforts.
So when you email W&P about it, we just forward it to Melanie now.
Yes, happy to be that point person and happy to have that information. So I thought it'd be helpful just to give everyone an idea of what an evaluative framework looks like. So it's comprised of several parts that assist us in making property evaluations. It includes things like a statement of significance, period of significance and justification, related context themes to consult for further information, and criteria for eligibility. The statement of significance establishes significance and eligibility for properties associated with the context theme. So in this case, we consider extant earthquake shacks that retain integrity to be eligible under both criterion A1 events and C3 architecture for their association with arguably the most important event to affect San Francisco in the 20th century, the 1906 earthquakes and fires, and as a distinctive type and method of construction. These were a really unique property type, as we have discussed. We define the period of significance as 1906 to 1915 to capture the construction of the earthquake shacks, the closure of camps across the city in 1908, and alterations to earthquake shacks that occurred as part of their relocation onto private lots across the city. The evaluative framework also establishes character-defining features of the property type and outlines integrity considerations. This consists of the physical features that must be intact for the property to convey its significance. So you see some of the features that are associated with extant shacks. As Woody mentioned, they're often extremely altered, are definitely no longer green most of the time, and have a variety of features that have become kind of common to their alterations. So because alteration is part of the earthquake shack's history, we've taken that into consideration when establishing a bar for integrity, especially for properties that we're identifying under events. Also to help us kind of identify earthquake shacks, we have a staff architect of ours that's working on some drawings of the most commonly seen types of altered shacks. They all sort of follow similar configurations. So those drawings will be added to the document later and will help us and also you all identify some more of these for us to preserve. Okay, so that kind of leads to our larger effort that I've alluded to throughout the presentation, the SF survey, which is our citywide cultural resources survey. So SF survey is a multi-year effort to identify and document places that are culturally, historically, and architecturally important to San Francisco's communities. And by bringing people together through community engagement, we aim to sustain San Francisco's cultures and enhance our collective sense of belonging and agency in our communities. The results of SF survey will raise awareness of cultural resources in addition to guiding the department's decisions on new development, area plans, and building permit applications. Cultural resources may also qualify for protections and incentive programs. As you can imagine, this consists of a lot of interwoven components. These include community engagement, the citywide historic context statement, survey collection, and findings and adoption. And all of this will result in a publicly accessible cultural resources inventory at the end of the day. The citywide historic context statement, which we began in 2020, forms the survey's foundation for decision-making by providing a comprehensive framework for identifying and evaluating San Francisco's historic and cultural resources. The outline of the citywide historic context statement is available on our website and includes thematic, cultural, and architectural contexts. It builds upon contexts that are in progress and also ones that have been completed previously, like the modern architecture and landscape design context, as well as the LGBTQ context statement. So I also just wanted to give everyone an idea of kind of how we've outlined basically the whole history of San Francisco. This slide gives you an idea of some of the thematic context statements that we've identified so far. The bold contexts are things that are currently in progress. And then on the next slide, we are also working on a series of culturally focused historic context statements, which we'll be working with community members to produce.
Hold on, you can be an intern for the planning department and get to work on something called women's rights?
Yes, that's a good plug. We have a really amazing internship program every summer. The application period is now closed, but if you know anyone that's interested in planning or history, we offer several internships every summer. I started with the department as an intern, so I can wholeheartedly recommend it. It's a really good program, and you get to learn a lot of really great things about the city.
I interned with WNP too.
Okay, so to get back to some more technical terminology, I guess, the survey collection. Staff will gather and collect information, conduct research, refer to the context statement in order to determine whether or not something is a resource. For all previously unsurveyed properties in the city that are 45 years or older, which makes them eligible. And to collect and manage this data, we are using a program called Arches that will eventually house our cultural resource inventory, which will be made accessible to the public. As always, we rely heavily on our community for input throughout this process, and nothing is going to change with the survey. We recently completed a draft of our community engagement framework, which aligns with the Historic Preservation Commission's racial and social equity resolution. And this provides a roadmap that consists of many strategies seen on this slide to help us include and engage communities typically underrepresented in historic preservation. The framework will be reviewed at the Historic Preservation Commission's April 20th hearing, and we also welcome your feedback. To give you an idea of kind of how all this will wrap up a few years from now and kind of on an ongoing basis, once our team prepares the initial survey findings, we'll present them with our determinations on potential individual resources and districts to the community. And once we kind of get the feedback and the blessings from the community, we'll then follow that with a hearing at the Historic Preservation Commission. The Historic Preservation Commission may elect to immediately adopt the findings, or they may take no action and then direct us to incorporate edits. If the HPC adopts the context statement and the survey, the findings will then be forwarded to the California Office of Historic Preservation, and they'll be considered finalized. So I probably don't need to explain this to all of you, but there are a lot of benefits to doing a historic resource survey. So kind of high level, this will result in clearer project review, the addition of more properties, maybe more earthquake shacks to the Article 10 landmarks work program, ability to apply for historic preservation incentives, greater community and neighborhood recognition, provide a foundation for future cultural heritage strategies, and we'll have this amazing database that's accessible to us and the public, which will result in shared knowledge of the great history of the city that we live in. To wrap things up, I just wanted to give you an idea of what we all are working on at the department. So we're currently undergoing pilot field work in the Crocker Amazon neighborhood that will likely continue throughout the spring. And then, as I mentioned previously, we'll present our community engagement framework at the Historic Preservation Commission on April 20th, if you want to tune in to learn more about that. Moving forward, we're always learning, so we'll likely use the lessons that we're likely to learn over the next several months to refine our process and then begin phase 1 of survey field work later on this year. We'll continue to make progress on the citywide historic context statement throughout and continue to lean on you all as the community experts during that process. And then one final plug for me, I just threw a lot of information out there. We have a really great website if you want to stay tuned on the progress of this project. It has our existing historic context statements there, our community engagement framework there. We regularly post updates. You can also contact us at our team email or leave us a voicemail at our phone number, and we'll get back to you. Thank you all for your time, and we hope to continue working with you.
Thank you, Melanie. And thank you to everybody who joined us today, especially Melanie Bishop, Jane Cryan, and Woody LaBounty for sharing your stories about your connection to the earthquake shacks. These are all of our email addresses, 10 guesses on who the Cottage Lady email address is. You can reach me at nicole@outsidelands.org, Melanie and Woody on the right there. And that will conclude the formal portion of today's or this evening's presentation. Now, if anybody has any questions, I encourage you to ask the experts while they're in the Zoom room. And I'll look over some that are in the chat right now as well. Feel free to unmic yourselves and ask questions personally. You don't have to stay muted for this part of it, but let me see if there's any questions.
I also want to add that something Melanie maybe can't talk about being an employee of the city, but one big benefit of the survey is there's a lot of state bills that are overriding local development, local zoning rules essentially. But if something is determined a historic resource, they can often evade some of these bills that are coming from Sacramento. So that's why it's important, if somebody wants to, use some state bonus plan to tear down an earthquake shack and build 5 units, if it's determined to be a historic resource, they might be able to avoid that. So anyway, the survey work is very, very important to helping us preserve a lot of San Francisco architecture.
Yeah. Jane, is there any story that you wanted to tell that you were like, I didn't have time to get into the presentation?
Are you speaking to me?
Yes, Jane, are there any stories that you would like to add?
Oh, well, I see on my screen that 22 people want to chat. So maybe we should chat with them.
I'm looking through the chat. Mostly it's people telling us that you're amazing.
I do want to add some locations. I think we
It says 22 people wanted. Linda, hi, Linda. Oh, there's my friend Linda Feldman. Oh my gosh.
I was going to say
look at that.
Jane's Little Red Shacks were on 24th Avenue in the Sunset, the 1200 block. The Goldie Shacks were originally on 34th Avenue, just off Gary, between Gary and Clement. The Kirkham Shacks were on Kirkham Street in the outer Sunset, just in case you're wondering.
May I add something about the Kirkies?
Yes.
Woody, what did you ever do with the trough for livestock that was on the site? That was the most endearing thing.
We had a lot of interesting artifacts that were found in deconstructing and rehabilitating the Kirkham Shacks before their move to the zoo. And I guess this is a good story, and it kind of tells you what a great preservative sand can be, because the residents of the earthquake shacks on Kirkham Street mostly seem to throw their garbage underneath their houses. We pulled off the sides of the little stilts that the shack was on, and underneath was cans and newspapers. We found newspapers that dated back to the 1920s that were still preserved, legible. They were buried in sand underneath the shack, and some of them we actually gave to the History Center at the San Francisco Library. But with Jane, there was basically like a horse trough in the back.
Oh, okay.
And then we also did we had some archaeologists come out and do some digging, some volunteer archaeologists. They mostly found basically refuse that people had thrown out, broken dishes, things like that. I believe they're all still in one archaeologist's garage in Mission Terrace. They've been there for 20 years. But very neat, very neat. We also, just like the, I don't know, the remnants of people's lives in the 20s and 30s kind of underneath the house. Really neat stuff.
So what is this with now we have 25 people, 26 wanting to chat. How did they get to chat?
They are chatting with each other.
Oh.
There's a text chat, Jane. If you click chat on the bottom of your screen, you'll see a whole bunch of messages of people talking to each other by typing.
Oh, people are talking, people who are in the audience are talking with each other.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
I have a question for Jane.
Tim has a question for Jane.
Jane, it was not clear to me during your presentation. Do you currently live in a relief shack?
Did you say, do I currently live in a shack cottage?
Yes.
No, the only shack cottage I ever got to live in was the little red house behind me that I got landmarked. And in fact, I'm not even in the city anymore. In 2007, I lost my rent-controlled apartment to an owner move-in, and that was it. After 44 years in the city, I had to regretfully come back to my home state of Wisconsin. So, but I'm just happy that I had the time I had with the shacks in the city.
Jane, is your society still active?
No, it isn't. I couldn't find anybody willing to take it on, and I sort of shut it down in 1999. But I did confer with people like Woody and goodness sakes, what Woody's done is just phenomenal. What Woody has done for the shacks is just, oh my God.
I do want to say that Jane wrote a whole book that is still needs
Two
to be
books.
Well, 2 books really, that's right, that still need to be published. So
Yes.
just to
And
get
I have something to add to that. Because of your putting that shack on Market Street for the 100th anniversary, and my asking you if I could babysit it for a while, I was in the shack when the publisher and editor of a very large book publishing firm came into the shack, asked me a question, that I couldn't remember the answer to. And I had brought with me the mock-up I had done of the main shack book I wrote. And I hauled it out, and these two people went crazy about it and gave me their cards and said, please be in touch with us. But that was 2 weeks before I was departing San Francisco against my will, and I just did not. I couldn't do anything about it. It just, I didn't have the attitude to even try and follow up on that. But at this point, I'm in the process of writing a book right now. I've got 100,000 words into it. I want to get a first draft of this thing. As soon as I've got one whole first draft of this big book I'm writing, I'm going to bop back to the two shack books, update them, and I think I can rekindle this interest with this particular publisher. Hopefully there are going to be 2 books out there.
Great.
Nobody else has written anything that they put in book form. So.
We wouldn't dare. We wouldn't dare.
Oh, well.
Waiting for yours.
Well, I wouldn't blame them. It's been what, my God, it's been,
Nicole?
I had just turned 40 when I moved into the shack, and I just now turned 80. So it's been 40 years since that I've had all this time to get these books out. And, but I will do it, but I must get to first draft with the big book I'm currently writing,
Hey, Nicole,
which has nothing to do with shacks.
Nicole, can you allow me to share my screen? Have you people been seeing these photos that David's been putting up? He just shared one. I don't know if you can share your screen, but oh, here we go. Let me see. I just wanted to show that. Oh, here we go.
They're great.
Oh my gosh.
But you can see they're sort of on stilts. So that's
Oh
me.
my, that's Miranda, isn't it?
Yes, that's my daughter. She looks exactly the same. She hasn't grown 1 inch. No, she's like 5'11", 25
Oh my
years old.
gosh, that is a wonderful photo.
But just to show you that, you know, we pulled off the little sides there and just started pulling out things. And I got to say, the workmen that we were with were like, "Can I keep this bottle?" We were like, sure, it's a milk bottle. Go ahead. But we found all sorts of treasures underneath that shack. So
Wow.
You're so cool.
So how do I see all the comments?
Well, I can read some to you, James.
Oh, no, that's okay. Will you be saving them so I can look at them?
We will be saving the chat, and I can send them to you and to everybody who registered. I can send them out, as well as a link to the recording once we have it up on our YouTube page, or more accurately, once Arnold Woods finds the time to put it up on our YouTube
I just
page.
want to say that I see my friend Linda Feldman, and hi! And I also saw my friends Stephen Craybiel and Donald Andrini. Yeah. Oh boy, this is really exciting.
This has been exciting to present for everybody, to get to show everyone your work, but mostly I'm excited that you're excited about Zoom events. You've been sending me ideas for the next Zoom event we can do with Jane, and I'm
we're all tired of
Yeah,
it.
I keep feeding ideas to you. Yeah, I want Woody and I to have like an hour and a half. I'll talk about, he can talk about the Kirkies.
We're gonna go on the road, Jane. We're gonna go on the road.
Oh, I'd love to
Do the-
talk about the
We'll do
gold.
the circuit, you and I. Don't worry.
Wow.
I'm here for it.
Jane, I have one more question. Jane, are there any videos of you playing piano at Pier 23, you know, maybe like YouTube or something?
I don't think so. I only started learning to play the piano when I was 37. I went out to CCSF for a year as a music major, learned to read music, and then I hung out with musicians and watched what they did. and I'd go home and try it. And I got good enough at some point that I was allowed to play at the pier between sets. But I don't think in those days, that was a long time ago. I don't think in those days people were running around with video cameras. So there aren't. But gee, now that I know how to Zoom,
Yeah,
I guess I
we've
could
opened
put
up a
together
door.
a show of me at the piano and have a virtual audience. Wouldn't that be fun?
Yeah.
Well, that sounds like W&P's next History Happy Hour.
Let me just let's wrap this up with a little preview of what could happen. Next time we'll find out why Jane came to San Francisco in the first place and who was her pen pal that encouraged her to come.
Can't I just drop a little bit of the hint?
Okay, go ahead.
Yes.
The whole story is at the Beat Museum.
All right. There was a famous
Okay.
person who got Jane to come to San Francisco. We'll do that next time.
Here, I'm going to drop a little bombshell for all my wonderful friends in the audience. I had a very interesting mother. She was an Auntie Mame. And she had me and she said, okay, now just go and do whatever you want. So I lived my childhood pretty much unsupervised. And I learned that if I said I was going to the library, I could go anywhere I wanted. Nobody ever asked me what I read at the library. So it was 1950. When did the beatnik thing happen? 58?
Well, On the Road was published in 57, so it got started a little earlier.
Well,
Spoiler alert. Spoiler alert.
it hit my hometown, Milwaukee, in 58. And coffee houses sprang up all over Milwaukee. And there was one within walking distance of my house. And it was called Hell. So one night, I went to the quote unquote library, but I really went to hell, the coffee house. And as fate will have it, that night, the king of Milwaukee beatniks was in hell. And he saw me, cute, pudgy little 16-year-old, and he invited, and I was all by myself, and he invited me to come and sit with the people he was, with all his admirers seated around him, which I did. And he asked me, have you read On the Road? And I said, no, I haven't. Oh, he said, you really should read it. Jack Kerouac is such a wonderful writer. And I said, I was so naive. I said, well, I haven't heard of Jack Kerouac either. Well, anyway, so of course, the next day I hurried out and I got a paperback copy of On the Road. And I thought it was the most wonderful book I had ever read. I especially liked the line, oh, gnashing teeth of earth. That really got me. And I decided that I would write to Mr. Kerouac in care of his publisher. And I didn't hear from Kerouac right away, but I heard from a man in San Francisco who was a good friend of Kerouac's, who said, why don't you contact Kerouac's agent, Mr. Sterling Lord in New York City? So I rewrote the whole thing to Kerouac, sent it to Sterling Lord Literary Agency in New York City. And about 3 months later, I had a note from Jack Kerouac.
Well, never mind. We don't have to do the next Boom, it's already out
And
there.
I forgot to say that in my opening note to Kerouac, I had enclosed one of my newest poems that I had written. So he wrote to me and he critiqued my poem. And he said, you know, if you have another one to send it along. So this went on for 2 years. And about in year 2, Kerouac, now he had no idea how old I was. I sent him one of those dime store strip photos of me, you know, where you sit in the machine and it takes pictures. I sent him a photo and I looked pretty young, but he never would have believed I was 16. Anyway, along about the second year of our hit and miss correspondence, he started saying, San Francisco is no place for a poet. You should, or Milwaukee is no place for a poet. You should be in San Francisco. And that's how I ended up.
Oh, that's great.
That's how I ended up. The day I was 19, I got on a Greyhound bus in Milwaukee. Kerouac was supposed to meet me at the Greyhound station, but he was in his last days then of his alcoholism and everything. When I got there, one of the Dharma bums was there to meet me. And I called, I think his name is Jerry Cimino, the museum director at the Beat Museum. I emailed with him. I said, hey, I've got a story. Would you like it for the museum? And he said, yeah. So I wrote up the story and I sent photos of how I looked then. And oh, when I told my mother I was moving to San Francisco on my 19th birthday, she demanded to see everything that I was taking before I took it from the house. And she found all of Kerouac's notes and she took them and destroyed them. But I kept one thing. It was a postcard on City Lights books, something from City Lights books that said that I was credentialed to eat and bleat with the elite beat in San Francisco. And so I sent that to the Beat Museum along with the, but anyway, that's the only reason I'm in I was in San Francisco, because Kerouac told me to go there. I never would have left Milwaukee unless somebody had told me to go to San Francisco.
Well, I just died, Jane.
I'm going to go to Milwaukee now that I've heard that story, because good things happen in Milwaukee. But thank you all for having me. I'm going to head out now.
Thank you all.
Bye,
Yeah,
good
there's no way
night.
to go from here. So,
Okay, good night.
good night,
Oh.
everybody.
Bye, Jane. Talk soon.
Thank you, everyone.